Now, I love living in the city, having neighbors, being able to walk to a coffee shop, go to the park. But I actually grew up living most of my elementary years living in the country, rural Wisconsin, and we had horses growing up. Now, these horses would eat down to the dirt anything that was growing in their fenced in area. Is it called a corral? A pen? I'm not really sure because we moved to the city and I fully converted to city life when I went into middle school. But as a kid, we had horses and multiple pens with electric fences around them. And yes, I've experienced that jolt of the fence when I was trying to crawl under it as a child. Now, in one of those pens, we grew alfalfa and other green grasses that we occasionally would allow the horses to go and feed on besides the normal hay that they would get. But we couldn't leave them in there for too long because they would just go to town on all that green deliciousness that was in there. Did you know that a horse should eat 1 to 2% of their body weight a day? You see, this is probably why people groups who were pastoralists were also nomadic. They needed fresh pastures and fields to feed their animals. And this is just true also of the Mongols. So let's dig into their story a bit today. Thanks for stopping by once again on my channel. My name is Steph Gergis, or if you're in my class, Mrs. Gergis to you. And I'm a social studies teacher where we learn about yesterday to understand today and help write a better tomorrow together. Now, today we get to talk about the Mongols. And you have to understand a few things about them. The Mongols created the largest contiguous, meaning connected, empire in all of human history. It went from Central Asia into what we know today of as Russia, into the west of the fragmenting Abbasid Caliphate, to the east into the Golden Age, and made basically the Song Dynasty collapse. But how did this all happen? Let's rewind the story a bit to get some context. We know that the empires that we've learned about already, like the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate and the Song Dynasty in China, were connected via the Silk Road. But we also know that there was a lot of land in between and across Central Asia. And in the steppe areas of Asia, there lived a variety of nomadic groups, like the Turks, which we've already learned about as well. In the case of this video, the Mongols. Now remember, nomadic people moved around with the seasons and with their animals, in which they lived off of those animals' byproducts. They were pastoralists. Pastoralism is where people domesticate animals or livestock, and they graze on open lands. This makes sense why pastoralists had to move from the different seasons to be able to get food for their animals. In the case of the Mongols, they herded sheep and cattle and yaks even. Who knew? They also rode horses, which were hugely important to their civilization, so valuable that they were often even buried with them when they died. Now, because they were often on the move, they needed living structures that were also mobile. They lived in tents called yurts, which they could pack up and move between their summer and winter campsites where they lived. Now, in general, nomadic people groups were more egalitarian or equal. Women had significant power and they managed migrations and the animals and families and even military strategy. Men, well, most of their job was really warfare and protecting their people. So back to those ideas of their horses. They were really good at riding horses, along with using bows and arrows, and even crossbows. Like crazy good. It's said that kids learned to ride horses when they were 3 years old. I'm just saying, my child is 3 years old right now, and we're still working on pushing the pedals on a tricycle and using a balance bike. Much less hopping on an animal that's 25 times heavier than him, that could trample him, that crushed like the bones of my little kitty when I was a kid living out on that rural farm we had. So, yeah, that's pretty amazing in their abilities to ride horses. Additionally, because they didn't produce more than animal goods, nomadic people typically were very involved with trade. So let's dig into the story of the Mongols specifically. As I mentioned before, nomadic people often fought with each other. And they were pretty tough individuals typically. I mean, they essentially lived outside in their yurts, enduring the elements of the weather. I mean, 1 week of camping in Canada for me, when it rained for like 2 days, led me to, let's see, never camp again since that freshman year trip of high school. Sorry, I like the Holiday Inn. But unlike me, they were pretty tough, and they fought with each other until a certain man united these various nomadic people groups together. And who was that man? His name was Temujin, but you may be more familiar with the name of Genghis Khan, which actually isn't even how you say it. It's actually Chinggis Khan. This actually often happens throughout history where Europeans can't pronounce a name, and so the true names kind of gets lost over time, and people opt for the easier name, and so that's why people call him Genghis Khan. But in reality, Chinggis is the way, much like how people in Wisconsin and outside of Wisconsin call Giannis Antetokounmpo just Giannis. He's from the Milwaukee Bucks. But either way, back to the Mongols. Chinggis Khan rose to power by creating strategic alliances with other people and united neighboring groups. And if they didn't want to be united, he maybe conquered them. Pretty violently, if we're being totally honest. They would surround villages at times. They wouldn't let people in or out. They would offer them the opportunity to surrender, but there are plenty of accounts that paint a pretty grim picture of what would happen if you didn't surrender. A Persian chronicler mentioned how they severed off people's heads and put them in piles. Ibn al-Athir, a Muslim scholar, told of how the Mongols would spare none, slaying women and men and children, ripping open pregnant women, and killing even their unborn babies. They would often enslave artisans and skilled workers, but their brutality is pretty well documented. For unskilled laborers, sometimes they would even put them at the front of the battle lines, and they would serve as human shields. See, Mongols were known to slit throats and decapitate their enemies, or if it was royal blood, they would merely just break their back so they wouldn't spill that blood. We'll come back to that story just a little bit later in this video. Reality is this: Chinggis Khan ends up on top military strategists in all of human history, if there were lists. And there's lists. You can Google it. He conquered about 20% of the Earth's surface, and with his grandsons, it's about 10 million square miles. 10 million square miles. Whoa. Chinggis Khan organized his people into groups of tens and hundreds with leaders over each of the groups. They fought diligently as a group, and if they didn't or tried to retreat, they would kill the entire group of people that fought with him. These fighting forces would fight together, and they would die together. The leaders of these battalions would be promoted based on merit, not simply because they were family or friends, but really based on their ability to be loyal and obviously were good at fighting and leading people. He also then divided up the winnings evenly between the people that fought for him. He also incorporated former rival tribes into his army, but basically spread them out into different regiments so they couldn't maybe join together and topple his power. Mongols were also shamanists who believed in a spiritual realm around them. And in that spiritual realm, shamans interacted with their previous ancestors, as well as different spirits. Their god was the sky god known as Tengiri. Chinggis is recorded to have said, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." And punish the people they did. During the lifetime, they conquered Central Asia, northern China, and kind of that eastern fringe of the Abbasid Empire that was fragmenting apart. However, Chinggis Khan died in 1227. Power then shifted to his children, who then conquered the Turks in Central Asia and brought the Russian princes under their submission in the 1230s. By 1253, they conquered the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad and also the Song dynasty in southern China by 1279. However, this united Mongol power didn't really last that much longer after Chinggis' death, and his grandsons fought for control. It was pretty much a full-on civil war, which caused the empire to break into 4 separate powers, or khanates, led by a khan, or a king. In China, the Song dynasty would be replaced by Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty. In the Middle East, the Ilkhanate replaced the Abbasid Caliphate. In Central Asia, you would find the Chagatai Khanate, and in Russia, you would find the Golden Horde. These would be the 4 Khanates. Now, each of these Khanates were unique due to the empires that they had replaced that came before them. In China, Chinggis' grandson, Kublai Khan, took the role of Emperor of China and even claimed the Mandate of Heaven. The conquest was less brutal in southern China, and there was more religious tolerance for Buddhism and Confucianism that existed in China. Kublai also helped aid in the existing infrastructure projects in China, like building more and better roads. Remember those artisans the Mongols sometimes spared in battles and kept as slaves? Well, they were imported to China from the Arab world and from Russia to work in the Chinese large bureaucratic system that they had. They didn't use the civil service exam anymore. Instead, they used those foreigners, and they ended up spreading some of even Islamic beliefs into China. Chinese people were discriminated against by the Mongols, and intermarriage was forbidden. And the Chinese people were appalled at the powerful position that Mongolian women had. In the Middle East, the Mongols advanced on the region militarily, led by a different grandson, Hulagu. He told the caliph, remember that's the religious and political leader all wrapped up in one, wrapped is maybe a funny word to use right now, to surrender to the Mongol forces. And the caliph, al-Mustasim, refused and challenged them to take his city. Clearly, he was slightly overconfident in their abilities and perhaps didn't read, online stories about their brutality. But this is what happens. Remember how they didn't want to shed royal blood and so they'd break people's backs? Well, they didn't break his back in that way. They rolled him up in a carpet and trampled him with those horses. And that ended the Islamic Golden Age in Baghdad. After conquering, they were less familiar ruling in a vast administrative system that was established in the former Islamic Empire, and so they actually allowed many Persians to work different government jobs, despite the fact that initially their horses ruined a lot of their fragile local geography in the region due to overgrazing. Now, they had religious tolerance in the Ilkhanate, which led to many Mongols actually converting to Islam, and gave Christians in the region actually more freedom than they maybe experienced in the past, despite the fact that they should have had a lot of rights because they were people of the book. Now, over time, many Mongols eventually turned into agriculturalists and settled in that region, and by the 1330s were highly assimilated into the local culture of the Turks and the Persians. Now, Mongol rule in Russia looked the most different of all of these khanates. The land there simply was not really friendly to nomadic lifestyles of the Mongols, especially with their harsh winters, and us from Wisconsin know what that looks like. Unlike China and the Middle East, which worked better. Instead, we find here in Russia that the Mongols indirectly ruled the Golden Horde by extracting tribute and taxes from the Russian princes. Some princes benefited as these tax collectors became kind of wealthy themselves. They skimmed a little off of that. Plus, the Russian Orthodox Church actually flourished as well because of the policy of Mongol tolerance in regard to religion. Plus, they were tax exempt. There was very little Mongol assimilation in Russia, mostly because there weren't many Mongols in Russia. And they simply just dominated them from a distance. Russia benefited from an influx of new technologies from China and trade along the Silk Road. Now, due to the Mongol conquest, most of the Silk Road was overseen by this single political entity, and it reached its height during this time. kind of a little bit of a spoiler alert, but the rise of transoceanic merchant activity will take over as the supreme trading route after this period. But right now, it's all about the Silk Road. Now, the peace that was brought because of the Mongols was known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which helped promote peace and stability throughout the territories during this era, which the Mongols were very active. Under the protection of these laws and under the relay stations along the Silk Road network, the commercial routes were safe from external threats. It allowed the superhighway to become even more used than it was in the past. Goods moved along, as well as, diseases, as we'll get to. Mongol rulers often offered merchants above asking price just to promote trade. You want $100 for that silk clothing? How about I give you $110? Sure, pay me more. People like selling goods for more than they expected to sell it for. Just watch any HGTV house show, and that's the theme of all of the house flipping that goes out there. So as we learned about yesterday in the Mongolian Empire, I can't quite end without a few caveats. Were the Mongols a brutal civilization? Yes, but what do I mean by that? As we understand yesterday and today, we see that those who wrote history often painted people groups certain ways. Were the Romans brutal in the conquest around the Mediterranean? Did they also rape and pillage villages? Oftentimes in history, we get told the rosy parts of the story and the gruesome details get left out if the history is written by the winners. Now, the Mongols are a little bit different in that their story was written by other people. It was written by the victims. Many times the Mongols are painted as other to Europeans. I mean, they were Asian. And so the gruesome details are left in the story, and their accomplishments maybe are left out or are glossed over. And that's why it's important to understand history and analyze who wrote the story. They did bring a lot of good to the world, as well as being absolutely brutal in their conquests, like most conquerors within history. Yes, but as a social studies teacher, I just have to say, sourcing is so important, and understanding a full picture of history can help us all write a better tomorrow. So until next time, thanks for stopping by. We'd love to have you stick around. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can hit the subscribe button below and throw a like if you learned something new about the Mongols today. Have a good one.